in looking at some of our presidents, we have had a handful of presidents who have done a great job at the beginning of their term. Some of the people that I'd like to mention are Franklin Roosevelt goes in and feeds people in his first several years in office. Created some jobs programs, some of them worked, some of them didn't work. But if he had just been a 1 or 2 term president, he would have gotten a higher grade from me. As it was, it turned into pretty much a disaster across the board, but he had some good ideas at the beginning. George W. Bush, the more recent Bush, comes into office. A few months later, we have 9/11. One of the greatest tragedies in my lifetime, comparable to our prior generation, Pearl Harbor. There's nothing else in the lexicon of history for Americans that matches up other than Pearl Harbor and 9/11, in my opinion. And I had a unique experience that day. I was in Washington, D.C., and I saw the smoke rising from the Pentagon. And you will never forget that. And it was kind of interesting for me because there's a apartment complex right up the street here at Dallas and Montrose. And it burned down, some of you may remember, about 3 years ago. And I'm exiting the freeway while that fire's going on, and it has that black plume going up, and it freaked me out. I had my own version of PTSD because I was so traumatized as I'm in my car sitting in the worst traffic jam in my whole life, because I was on the west side of DC and I lived on the east side, and I had to traverse all of the district to get home that day. And so there are certain significant events that happened. George Bush did a masterful job of helping the United States recover, and yet he's a president that essentially is viewed as a failure because of the state of the economy and other things that happened while he was president. A great poster child for let's have 1 6-year term. Another person who did a fabulous job early and then failed was Lyndon Johnson, Texas's own Lyndon Johnson. Johnson was not a nice man. It's a fascinating story because when I went over a lot of the history stories and stories of different presidents, it was like, you know, they would tell you all these wonderful stories about their particular person. They're even, by the way, trying to rehabilitate the scandal-ridden Harding by now, by the way. They're working on making Harding look better, which I find fascinating. I couldn't find a reason to rehabilitate him, by the way, and I looked, just for grins. But what's interesting is that Lyndon Johnson comes in, his own biographer, and some of you are real history buffs who are familiar with this. Robert Caro, C-A-R-O, has written 3 large books on Lyndon Johnson, and he has 1 more to go. He's working on number 4 right now. So we used 2 of those 4, the 3 that he already had out, as meat for our book of basic research. And even he says that Johnson wasn't a decent guy. Even he says that, and usually these guys that write all these books on somebody are really into that person, like, gosh, this is really my hero. So it's a pretty interesting deal. Johnson comes in, he's in a feud with the Kennedy family. He comes in and dealing with the Kennedys, who were an extremely popular and powerful political family, he manages to get control of the White House, which was no mean trick when the Kennedys are against you, and takes over the White House. And he does 2 things almost immediately. He runs for office, and he gets the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the most significant piece of civil rights legislation in the United States since 1866, the first, what we call the old Civil Rights Act, that's still in effect, by the way. And he does it, and there's a play out, it played at the Alley last year, that presents a lot of him and a lot of what he did, because basically he assembled a group of Democrats from the North, Republicans, and a couple Democrats from the South, just enough to get the bill passed. His biggest obstacle was to overcome Southern Democrats who ardently opposed the passage of the Civil Rights Act. So he had to overcome his own party. So he's doing 2 things. He's recovering from a massive national tragedy, the assassination of an American president, and he's running for office, he's feuding with the Kennedys, and he passes a very important piece of legislation. And if he'd stopped there, he'd probably be number one. But what happens is that he then gets mired in his own existence once he gets past this great start. And of course he resigned, so he was in for about 6 years anyway. But he is largely thought of today as the failed architect of the Vietnam War. Now that's not really a fair criticism of Johnson, and I'm no big fan of Johnson.